You hear the iron gate slam behind you. The roar of 50,000 voices drops to a muffled thunder as you descend stone steps slick with condensation and something darker. The air down here tastes of copper and fear. Torchlight flickers across wet walls, and you realize with sudden, absolute clarity that victory for someone else means something unspeakable for you. The gladiator who just killed your brother is coming, and Roman law has given him a choice of rewards. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me how a story buried for 2,000 years can reach every corner of the planet today. In the summer of 79 AD, beneath the newly completed Flavian amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum, a network of chambers existed that most tourists will never see. These weren't storage rooms or animal pens. Archaeological excavations conducted between 2016 and 2019 by Dr. Isabella Fortunato's team from the University of Rome revealed something that made even seasoned historians pause. Small rooms, roughly 10 feet square, with iron rings embedded in stone walls at specific heights, drainage channels carved into floors with disturbing precision, and scratched into the limestone, desperate finger marks where human nails had clawed for purchase, for hope, for any proof they'd existed. Carbon dating confirmed what the architectural evidence suggested. These rooms were original to the structure, built with the same intentionality as the Emperor's Box or the elaborate pulley systems that lifted lions into the arena. They were purpose-built chambers for what Roman administrative records clinically termed the allocation of conquered females to victorious combatants. In simpler, more honest language, these were rooms where female prisoners of war became the spoils given to gladiators who'd pleased the crowd. Her name was Aurelia, though that's not what she'd been called in her homeland. The Romans renamed their captives, stripping away even the dignity of identity. She was 19 years old, daughter of a Dacian chieftain, captured 3 months earlier when the legions crushed the last resistance in the Carpathian highlands. She'd watched her father die on a Roman sword. She'd been marched 700 miles in chains, surviving when others didn't, though she wasn't certain survival was mercy. Now she stood in a holding cell with 14 other women, all of them scrubbed clean by attendants who worked with the efficiency of people preparing meat for market. They'd been given fresh tunics, not kindness, but presentation. One of the older women, a priestess whose name the Romans had also erased, whispered the truth they all sensed. They're making us ready for after the games, after the killing, after the crowd's bloodlust had been satisfied by watching men die and needed a different kind of entertainment. Above them, the afternoon spectacle was reaching its crescendo. Titus Flavius Maximus, the name itself was probably invented by whatever master owned him, was fighting for his life against a Germanic prisoner who'd been a warrior before Rome made him a gladiator. The crowd of 50,000 didn't know or care about either man's real name. They wanted blood rhythm, the dance of death, the moment when one man's skill or luck ran out and red sand told the story. Maximus was 31 years old, which made him ancient by gladiatorial standards. Most died or were crippled by 25. He'd survived 43 sanctioned combats, each one a miracle of violence and chance. His body was a map of scars, each marking a moment when death had come close enough to touch. What drove him wasn't glory. That was a lie told by poets who'd never held a sword while 50,000 strangers screamed for your death. What drove him was the promise, always dangled and never quite delivered, of the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. The Germanic warrior fell at 3:47 in the afternoon, Maximus's gladius finding the gap between helmet and shoulder guard. The crowd erupted. The emperor, barely 20 years old and still learning the performative gestures of power, gave the thumbs-up signal. Maximus had won. He was entitled to his reward. In the administrative machinery beneath the arena, a clerk made a notation in wax. Maximus, 43rd victory, entitled to standard compensation plus victor's privilege. Another clerk consulted a different tablet. 14 Dacian females available, holding cell 7. The bureaucracy of brutality operated with remarkable efficiency. Rome had systematized everything, even exploitation. What you need to understand is that this wasn't considered cruelty by Roman standards. This was order. This was law. This was tradition stretching back centuries to when Republican generals had first granted soldiers the right to plunder conquered cities, which included, without need for specification, conquered women. The empire had simply refined the practice, moved it from chaotic battlefield rape to organized, sanitized allocation. They'd made it civilized, which somehow made it worse. At least battlefield violence was honest in its savagery. This had paperwork. Maximus descended into the hypogeum, the underground labyrinth, still wearing his arena armor, still spattered with blood that wasn't his, still shaking from combat adrenaline. The master of games met him in a torchlit corridor that smelled of damp stone and human waste. A bronze tablet was presented listing his options: 500 denarii in coin, 10 amphoras of Falernian wine, a week's leave from training, or what the tablet euphemistically called carnal privilege of conquest. For a man who owned nothing, whose life could end on any afternoon for the amusement of people eating honeyed dates in marble seats, this represented one of the few moments of power he would ever experience. The system was designed to make even slaves feel like conquerors, to give the powerless a taste of power over someone even more helpless. It was psychological engineering of remarkable sophistication. In holding Cell 7, Aurelia heard footsteps approaching. Heavy boots on stone. The sound of keys. The other women pressed back against the far wall, but there was nowhere to go. The door opened and a guard pointed directly at her. Not random selection. She'd been chosen specifically. Later, she would learn why. She was young. She was the daughter of a chieftain, and her humiliation had propaganda value. Broken nobility sent a message to unconquered Dacian territories more effective than any military dispatch. She was led through corridors where the sounds of the arena above became muffled, distant, unreal. They passed cells holding animals. She heard a lion's growl, smelled exotic spices mixed with animal musk. They passed other chambers where screams echoed, though whether from human or beast she couldn't tell. Everything was designed for efficient movement: elevators that could lift a full-grown elephant, pulleys that could raise trapdoors, channels that flushed blood and waste into the sewers that fed the Tiber. The Colosseum was an engineering marvel, and part of what it engineered was systematic dehumanization. The chamber she was brought to was surprisingly clean. Stone bench along one wall, a small window near the ceiling that let in a shaft of dusty light, iron rings set into the wall at shoulder height, a door that locked from the outside. This wasn't some improvised dungeon of spontaneous cruelty. This room had been planned, budgeted, constructed by skilled masons who'd been paid for their work. Someone had calculated optimal room dimensions. Someone had decided exactly where those iron rings should be placed. The banality of that calculation was more horrifying than any torture device. Maximus entered at 4:15. The door closed behind him with a sound that Aurelia would hear in nightmares for however long she had left to dream. He was enormous, 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5'7". His armor made him seem even larger, immortal, inhuman. He had a sword at his hip. She had nothing. Between them was the entire weight of Roman law, which said explicitly that she was property, spoils, his legal reward for violence successfully performed. Historical records don't tell us what Maximus felt looking at her. We have administrative documents, Senate debates, archaeological evidence, but the interior life of a slave gladiator, the thoughts of a man who'd killed 43 men and was now offered a woman as a prize, that's lost to us. We know only what happened next, reconstructed from later testimony during Senate hearings that nobody expected would ever occur. He removed his helmet, set down his sword, sat on the stone bench with his head in his hands. For 3 minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats, neither spoke. Aurelia remained frozen against the far wall, every muscle tensed for violence that didn't come. When he finally spoke, it was in broken Dacian, words he'd learned from prisoners in the barracks where gladiators were caged between fights. What was his name? She didn't understand immediately. Her mind was preparing for pain, not conversation. "Your father," Maximus continued, struggling with the language. "The chieftain. What was his name before they took it?" "Decebalus," she whispered, using her father's real name for the first time since capture. Maximus nodded slowly. "I killed a Decebalus today. Maybe your father, maybe another. Your people love that name." He looked at his hands, still trembling from combat. "I've killed 43 men whose names I never learned. Romans don't care about names, just about winning." What followed wasn't what Rome's system expected, programmed for, or had any mechanism to process. For 2 hours, 2 people the empire had tried to strip of humanity simply talked. Maximus told her about his father, executed for debt when Maximus was 9, about being sold to a gladiatorial school, about learning that survival meant becoming what he hated. Aurelia told him about her village, about the morning the legions came, about watching everything she loved burn. They didn't become friends. The gap between their positions was too vast for that. But for 2 hours they became something the system couldn't tolerate. Human beings acknowledging each other's humanity. At 6:20, Maximus made a decision that would cost him everything. He stood, walked to the door, called for the guard. When the surly attendant appeared, Maximus delivered his verdict with the flat authority of a man who'd earned the right to be heard. "This woman is diseased, contaminated. I reject the reward. Return her to general holding." It was the only loophole in an otherwise airtight system. Damaged or diseased rewards could be refused and returned to standard prisoner classification. The lie was transparent. Aurelia was visibly healthy, but challenging a gladiator's claim created more paperwork than accepting it. The guard shrugged, made a notation on his tablet, and led Aurelia away. Maximus remained in the chamber alone, staring at iron rings that had held countless others, at drainage channels that had served purposes he just refused to fulfill. You might think this is where the story becomes hopeful. It doesn't. Aurelia died 11 days later, not from violence but from dysentery in the overcrowded medical holding area where rejected prisoners waited for reassignment. The mercy that spared her from one horror delivered her to another, slower and just as fatal. Roman captivity killed through neglect as efficiently as through cruelty. Maximus never saw her again. He fought 3 more times that month, won all 3, refused rewards all 3 times. Word spread through the gladiatorial barracks. Maximus had gone soft, had converted to one of those strange Eastern religions preaching mercy had been cursed by Dacian witchcraft. Trainers beat him for refusing tradition. Other gladiators mocked him. And then something unexpected happened. On September 18, 79 AD, Senator Quintus Aurelius Symmachus stood before the Roman Senate with a formal complaint. His nephew, a junior gladiator, had been flogged by his trainer for refusing the traditional reward after a victory. The nephew claimed he'd been inspired by Maximus's example. The case was trivial, the kind of minor disciplinary matter the Senate usually dismissed. Except it forced Rome's political elite to acknowledge publicly what everyone knew existed but nobody discussed: the systematic use of conquered women as rewards in state-sponsored entertainment. The Senate debate that followed, preserved in fragments in the Acta Senatus housed in the Vatican archives, lasted 4 hours. Conservative senators defended tradition with the usual arguments. Our ancestors conquered utterly, body and soul, and that conquest built this empire. Reformist senators, influenced by Stoic philosophy and pragmatic concerns about provincial rebellions, countered that Rome was creating martyrs and propaganda for its enemies. One senator, whose name has been lost but whose words survive, asked the question that changed everything. Do we conquer territories or souls? Because if it's souls, this practice guarantees we never truly win. The decisive factor wasn't morality. It was political calculation. 3 provincial governors had reported increased rebellion recruitment, with Roman treatment of captive women explicitly cited in enemy propaganda. The empire was hurting itself, turning military victories into long-term insurgencies. On October 7, 79 AD, the Senate passed what historians call the Lex Feminarum Captivi, the law of captive women. Its provisions were narrow but revolutionary. Female prisoners of war could no longer be used as rewards in public spectacles. Private exploitation continued unregulated. The law didn't free anyone or truly protect anyone. But the public theater of humiliation ended, at least officially. Enforcement was inconsistent for decades. Many arena managers ignored it, but the principle was established. Even Rome had limits. Maximus received his rudes, his freedom, 4 months later, not for mercy but for winning 8 consecutive fights after the Senate debate made him politically useful. A gladiator who embodied Roman virtue, even accidentally, had propaganda value. His final recorded act as a free man appears in a manumission record dated March 15, 81 AD. He purchased and immediately freed one Dacian female prisoner whose Roman name was listed as Secunda. Whether she was one of the women from holding cell 7 that day remains unconfirmed but strongly suspected by historians who've studied the fragmentary records. In 2018, Dr. Fortunato's team made one final discovery in those underground chambers. Scratched into the limestone in crude Latin letters, barely visible after 2 millennia, Aurelia fuit hic. Aurelia was here. 3 words. An anonymous hand, possibly another prisoner, possibly even Maximus himself, had carved proof that she'd existed, that she'd had a name, that someone remembered. The tragedy isn't that Rome was cruel. Every ancient empire was cruel. The tragedy is that Rome systematized cruelty, bureaucratized it, turned human suffering into administrative procedure with supply chains and ledgers and purpose-built architecture. They made horror efficient, which made it sustainable, which made it normal. The guards who led women to those chambers weren't monsters. They were employees doing their jobs. The clerks who recorded allocations weren't sadists. They were bureaucrats maintaining records. The system made atrocity mundane, and that mundanity allowed it to continue for generations. What haunts me most isn't the violence. Violence was everywhere in the ancient world. What haunts me is the precision, the careful planning, the fact that someone sat down with an architect and said, "We'll need rooms for this purpose, here's the optimal layout." That level of organization reveals something about human nature that's harder to confront than simple brutality. We're capable of industrializing anything, even evil. Maximus disappears from historical records after 81 AD. We don't know how he died or where he's buried. Aurelia's remains, if they exist, are mingled with thousands of others in the mass graves outside Rome's walls where the anonymous dead of the empire were dumped. But 3 words scratched into stone survived. Aurelia was here. Stand in the Colosseum today, and tour guides will tell you about engineering marvels, about emperors and epic battles. They'll rarely mention the chambers underneath, and when they do, they'll use careful language about the realities of ancient warfare. History has a way of sanding down its sharpest edges, making monuments beautiful by forgetting what happened in their shadows. But the scratches are still there in the limestone, if you know where to look. And if you press your hand against that cold stone, you can almost feel it. The thundering crowd above, the torch smoke below, and somewhere in between. A moment when one man chose humanity over law and accomplished almost nothing except proving that the choice could still be made. The blood on that sand wasn't always from battle. Sometimes it was from innocence offered as entertainment, from power given no limits, from the moment an empire looked away and let cruelty become tradition. And sometimes, just rarely enough to hurt, it was from someone who refused, who remembered that before they were gladiator and captive, conqueror and conquered, they were human. That memory, scratched into stone, is what survives when empires fall.